Hello and welcome back to National Fishing Month TV. This time we're going to be looking at feeder fishing, which can be an excellent method on all waters. So the rods that you're going to use for feeder fishing are slightly different to the ones that you use for float fishing. In general, they're either called feeder rods or a quiver tip rod. And the reason for that is, we look at this end of the rod, we've got a very flexible tip, often with a brightly coloured end like that. And that is because that is your bite indicator. Because with a feeder, you're going to be fishing on the bottom of the lake, so you won't have a float to show you the bites. The bites come via this tip, which we call a quiver tip. This particular setup is designed for fishing with a maggot feeder. As you can see on here, we've got this device, which is known as a maggot feeder, and it's got holes in it, so when you fill it with maggots and cast it out, the maggots will come out of those holes around your hook bait, which we attach here via a very small size 18 hook, which is ideal for fishing with a couple of double red maggots. As with the reels, they're identical to what you would use for float fishing, a basic fixed spool reel or a match reel, and I've loaded it with some 4-pound line. Fishing fairly light, as we're fishing with a maggot feeder, we're not targeting anything particularly massive, so there's no need to go overboard with the line strength. As you'll see, the feeder can slide up and down the line here, and we've got a bead, which is actually a Drennan quick change bead, and these are ideal for this type of fishing because you can quite simply thread it on the line like so, and they pull apart. Very much like a Stonfo connector on the end of a pole. You attach this part via a figure of 8 loop knot to your main line after you've threaded the main part of the bead on. You attach a hook to nylon via this little hook here, close the bead, and there you have a perfect running feeder rig. So that is our maggot feeder setup. Okay, we're pretty much ready to go with the maggot feeder. But what you'll probably notice is the specific way in which I've set up in my swim. I've got my seat, which is at an angle to the lake, and obviously I'm positioning my rod at an angle to the lake as well. There's a very specific reason for doing that, which is because of the way that the bites are detected on the end of the feeder rod, or the quiver tip as we call it. You need to be positioned at an angle from where your line's pointing, because you get far better indication of the bites doing it that way. The chair that I've got is particularly good for this type of fishing because it comes with various accessories, such as this backrest where I can put the rod, and the side tray here where I can put the bait that I'm using at the moment, which is maggots, and also accessories such as my disgorger. The rod rest that I'm using is known as a feeder rest head, and this allows me to position the rod anywhere along here according to the angle at which I'm fishing. All in all, it's quite important to have everything positioned where you can reach it quite easily, because this type of fishing works very well if you can work fast and efficiently. So before we load the actual feeder, what you need to make sure you do is put your hook baits on. So we're going to put 2 maggots on the hook. The reason that is because if you put the maggots in the feeder first, before you put the hook baits on, chances are they'll have crawled out by the time you get maggots on the hook. So the feeder opens at the top here. It's important to keep your hands around the feeder to stop them crawling out the holes, and just fill it with some maggots, and we get the top of the feeder shut, and then I'm going to chuck it out to our spot, which is near the reeds. There we go. So once it's out in the water, we just need to make sure we tighten the line very gradually so that all the line on top of the water disappears, which it has done now. And then pop it on the rest, and then if necessary just give it a slight tighten so that there's just a slight bend in that rod so we can detect bites easily. And we've got a bite there straight away. but unfortunately didn't connect that time. In terms of bite detection, fishing with a maggot feeder is probably the most difficult out of the 3 setups we're using, and that's because often you can get bites from smaller fish, and the tackle that we're using is quite delicate as well. What you're looking for is basically quite deliberate movements, or twanging or bouncing if you like, towards where your hook bait is and where your feeder is, and then you'll know that you've definitely got a bite, and then you'll have to strike to set the hook. There we go, so that was a much more deliberate whack on the tip there. We've got a fish on, don't feel particularly big, but that's not really the aim of the game. It's still giving us a fair old scrap on this light gear. There we go, lovely little common carp caught on the maggot feeder. Right then, let's have a look at the groundbait feeder now. So the second type of feeder setup we're going to use is almost identical to the maggot feeder setup, except this time we're going to fish with a cage feeder, which we're going to fill with groundbait. We're using a slightly larger hook, we're using a size 14 hook, and we're using a slightly stronger line of 5 pounds this time, because we're going to be targeting some species perhaps a little bit bigger than we were getting on the maggot feeder. So again, the feeder is sliding to a Drennan quick change bead, and as you can see, it's a little metal cage which allows it to be filled with groundbait. Obviously, mixing the groundbait is a very important part of feeder fishing, so we're going to have a look at that next. So in order to fish with your groundbait feeder, you're going to need to mix up some groundbait. When you go to the tackle shop, you'll often get bags of groundbait which come dry like this. So they need to be mixed with water in order to get the right consistency. This is something that you really need to get right, because if you mix it too sloppy, it will come straight out the feeder on the cast. If you mix it too tough, it won't come out the feeder on the lake bed, and it won't work effectively for you. So the best way to do it is just to add water gradually to your mix. So I'm going to use about half the bag here, just going to add it to an empty bucket. And then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to add some lake water gradually to the mix. So I'm just going to start with a little bit here and start stirring it. Okay, so I'm going to add a little bit more water in now. Stir that in. Okay, let's get in there. Just to make sure it absorbs all that water. So this is probably about right. It's sticking into my hands nicely there, and that will enable me to mould that into the feeder, and it won't come out on the cast. If you do get it a bit too wet because you've got some in the bag because you haven't used it all, you can always add a little bit more in just to get that consistency right. But as I said, if it's like this, just sticking together, then that's probably about right. So again, as we did with the maggot feeder, we're going to put our hook bait on first. Going to use grain of sweet corn on a size 14 hook, and then we're going to load the groundbait feeder, or the cage feeder. So we've got our bucket of groundbait here. We're going to load the feeder with some groundbait about halfway and just start compressing it a bit more, and just gradually repeating that process until the cage feeder is fully loaded with groundbait and it's ready to cast out. So there we go, that feeder's ready now to pop out on the spot. There we go. Just going to pop it on the rest, tighten up the line, and fishing. One of the important things when you're feeder fishing is accuracy, and if you're consistently hitting the same spot every time, even if you're not getting bites, you're putting a carpet of food down that the fish can move in on. The best way to do that is by using the line clip on your reel. Now, what I've done at the moment is I've taken my rig off, so I've just got the cage feeder on, and what I'm going to do, I'm going to try and cast out to the spot, and if I get it as near as I want it on the spot, I'm going to clip the line on my reel under this clip here, so that when I cast out every time, it's going to hit that clip and drop the bait right on the same spot every time. So let's give that a go. That's not quite where I want it, so I'm going to pull off a little bit of line, and I'm going to put the line on the clip and try it again and see how close that's got. Right, so we're going to cast out again. Yeah, well, the line hit the clip there and it dropped it exactly where I want it. So I'm going to keep it on that position now on the reel, so that every time I cast out, it's going to go bang on the same spot and build up a good carpet of bait for the fish to feed on. They're really all over that spot now. Getting bites pretty much straight away every time we get the feeder out on the spot, and that's because a lot of the time on these types of venues the fish will associate the plop of the feeder landing with dinner time, and therefore that's how you can get quite a lot of bites very quickly. We've got a nice little mirror here. There we go. Okay, and finally, the last type of feeder fishing we're going to look at is a technique known as the method. In terms of the rods you're going to need for this, because you'll target carp primarily with this particular technique, you're going to need something a little bit more robust than we've used in the previous two setups. And what you can often find in tackle shops are rods like this, which are designed for dealing with carp. This one's called a carp feeder rod. The tip in particular is a bit stronger, and obviously in terms of the reel lines we use, we're going to use something a little bit stronger, so I've gone for 8 pounds line on this reel. The reel again is slightly different to what we've been using for the two previous setups, in that it's got this free spool facility on it, which allows a hooked fish to take line without pulling your rod in. That is because the method is what we call a self-hooking technique, or almost a bolt technique. The feeder sits on the bottom of the lake like this, and because the swivel is actually pushed into the feeder itself, that creates a kind of bolt effect. What we'll be doing is putting a small boilie on here, folding it into some ground bait which is moulded around the feeder, and then casting that out. What the fish will then do is basically eat all of the food that's on there, including the hook bait, and as it sucks that in, because we've only got a very short hook length here of a couple of inches, it will hook itself against the weight of the feeder. Then when it runs off, that free spool facility will kick in, it will be able to take line, and hopefully our rod won't go in with it. We're now on to the final type of fishing that we're going to do today, which is fishing with a method feeder. It can certainly be a very exciting way of fishing, and you can catch some big specimens doing it, including carp, bream and tench. So what we're going to do is first of all put our hook bait on. The difference with this is that the hook bait's not actually going to sit on the hook itself. We're fishing with a small hair rig, so we're going to have to use a needle to mount the bait on here and then fix it in place using a bait stop. So we're using a small barrel shaped boilie here, which is ideal for this purpose. It's 10mm in size, and we're going to push our baiting needle through the centre of the boilie so we can then thread it on to the hair rig. You can buy hair rigs ready made for this purpose in any tackle shop, so you don't have to tie them yourself. So we've threaded that onto the hair, and we're now going to fix it in place using this plastic bait stop known as a boilie stop. There we go. And then we're ready to load the feeder with some ground bait. So you'll notice that the feeder's got these ridges on it. This is what allows the ground bait to remain in place on the cast. So I'm going to get a bit of ground bait and mould it tightly around the feeder. Just one small layer there, just about cover the ribs. Then we're going to take the hook bait and fold that into the mix. Then we're going to take more ground bait and put it on top, and then squeeze that in as tightly as we possibly can until we get a nice little parcel of food that's going to sit on the lake bed and the fish are going to peck away at and eventually get to our hook bait, and they will hook themselves against the weight of this feeder. Let's get it out there and see how it works. With this method you don't have to fish on a particularly tight line, because the bites that we're looking for are very, very deliberate. What will actually happen is that the fish, as it's doing now, has just started taking line, which means it's hooked, and we're into another one. There we go, little common in the bag. Right, just one final bit of fun to end the session on. Throughout the afternoon I've been trickling in bait in the margins and got quite a lot of fish feeding close in. People often think that with the method it's something that you fish at distance, but that's not necessarily the case. It can be very effective fished right close in as well, which I'm going to do now. I'm going to fish it on a completely slack line so that the fish don't get spooked by a tight line going down to it, and I'm going to put the freeze pool facility on and see what we can get. This should be fun. Just going to drop it in right in close where I've been baiting. Plop that down now. Popping it on a completely slack line with the free spool facility on, and there's fish all over it. Oh, there we go. That was a take from the margins straight away. Well, that's our video on feeder fishing. I hope you enjoyed it, and I certainly hope that you'll be going out and trying those 3 methods on a venue near you very soon.